Chapter 3. The people exiled in 70 CE. It must first of all be emphasized that the Romans never deported entire peoples. We might add that neither did the Assyrians and Babylonians move entire populations from the countries they conquered. It did not pay to uproot the people of the land, the cultivators of produce, the taxpayers. But even the efficient policy of deportation practiced by the Assyrian, and later the Babylonian, Empire, in which whole sections of local administrative and cultural elites were deported, was not followed by the Roman Empire. Here and there in the Western Mediterranean countries, local farming communities were displaced to make room for the settling of Roman soldiers, but this exceptional policy was not applied in the Near East. Roman rulers could be utterly ruthless in suppressing rebellious subject populations. They executed fighters, took captives and sold them into slavery, and sometimes exiled kings and princes. But they definitely did not deport whole populations in the countries they conquered in the East, nor did they have the means to do so, none of the trucks, trains or great ships available in the modern world. Flavius Josephus, the historian of the Zealot revolt in the year 66 CE, is almost the only source for this exile, aside from archaeological findings dating to that time. His book Wars of the Jews describes the tragic outcome of that period's conflict. The devastation did not spread throughout the kingdom of Judea, but affected mainly Jerusalem and a number of other fortified cities. Josephus estimated that 1.1 million people died in the siege of Jerusalem and the great massacre that followed, that 97,000 were taken captive, and that a few thousand more were killed in other cities. Like all ancient historians, Josephus tended to exaggerate his numbers. Today most scholars believe that virtually all demographic figures from antiquity are overstated, and that a good many have numerological significance. Josephus does state that a large number of pilgrims had gathered in Jerusalem before the uprising, but the assumption that more than 1 million people were killed there is not credible. The population of the city of Rome at the height of the empire in the 2nd century CE might have approached the size of a medium modern conurbation, but there was no such metropolis in the little kingdom of Judea. A cautious estimate suggests that Jerusalem at that time could have had a population of 60,000 to 70,000 inhabitants. Even if we accept the unrealistic figure of 70,000 captives, it still does not mean that the evil Titus, who destroyed the temple, expelled the Jewish people. Rome's Great Arch of Titus shows Roman soldiers carrying the plundered temple candelabra, not, as taught in Israeli schools, Judean captives carrying it on their way to exile. Nowhere in the abundant Roman documentation is there any mention of a deportation from Judea. Nor have any traces been found of large refugee populations around the borders of Judea after the uprising, as there would have been if a mass flight had taken place. We do not know exactly how large the population of Judea was prior to the revolt of the Zealots and the war against Rome. Here, too, Josephus's figures are useless. He states, for example, that there were 3 million inhabitants in the Galilee. Archaeological surveys conducted in recent decades suggest that in the 8th century BCE, in the whole land of Canaan, that is, the strong kingdom of Israel and the small kingdom of Judah, there were some 460,000 inhabitants. Margan Broshi, an Israeli archaeologist, calculated, on the basis of the wheat-growing capacity of the country between the sea and the Jordan River, that at its most flourishing, during the Byzantine period in the 6th century CE, it could have sustained no more than 1 million inhabitants. Hence it is reasonable to assume that on the eve of the Zealot uprising, the population of the extended kingdom of Judea was between 500,000 and 1 million people. Wars, epidemics, droughts, or onerous taxation could reduce the population, but before the botanical and agro-industrial revolutions of modern times, the number of inhabitants could not increase to any great extent. The Zealots' internecine wars and their uprising against the Romans dealt the country massive blows, and the demoralization of the cultural elites after the destruction of the temple must have been profound. It's quite likely that the population in and around Jerusalem remained diminished for some time. But, as already stated, it was not expelled and, before long, recovered economically. Archaeological discoveries have shown that Josephus exaggerated the devastation, and that several cities had recovered their populations by the end of the 1st century CE. Moreover, the Jewish religious culture was about to enter one of its most impressive and fruitful periods. Unfortunately, there is little information about the systems of political relations during this period. We also have little information about the Second Messianic Revolt, which shook Judean history in the 2nd century CE. The uprising that broke out in 132 CE, in the reign of the Emperor Hadrian, popularly known as the Bar Kokhba Revolt, is mentioned briefly by the Roman historian Cassius Dio, and by Eusebius, the bishop of Caesarea and author of ecclesiastical history. Echoes of the events appear in the Jewish religious texts as well as in archaeological findings. Regrettably, there was no historian of the stature of Josephus at that time, so any reconstruction of events can only be fragmentary. The question arises, was the traditional story of the expulsion due to the traumatic consequences of that revolt? Describing the conclusion of the revolt, Cassius Dio wrote, 50 of their most important outposts and 985 of their most famous villages were razed to the ground. 580,000 men were slain in the various raids and battles, and the number of those that perished by famine, disease and fire was past finding out. Thus nearly the whole of Judea was made desolate. The characteristic exaggeration is plain to see. The figures used by ancient historians always seem to call for the subtraction of a zero, but even this grim report says nothing about deportations. Jerusalem was to be renamed Aelia Capitolina, and circumcised men were for some time barred from entering it. For 3 years, harsh restrictions were imposed on the local populace, especially around the capital, and religious persecution was intensified. Captive fighters were probably taken away, and others must have fled from the area. But the Judean masses were not exiled in 135 CE. The name Provincia Judea was changed to Provincia Syria Palestina, later Palestine, but its population in the 2nd century CE remained predominantly Judeans and Samaritans, and it continued to flourish for 1 or 2 generations after the end of the revolt. By the end of the 2nd century and beginning of the 3rd, not only had most of the farming population recovered and agricultural production stabilized, but the country's culture attained what came to be thought of as its golden age in the time of Rabbi Judah Har-Nasi. The year 220 C saw the completion and final arrangement of the 6 parts of the Mishnah, a far more decisive historical event than the Bar Kokhba revolt in the development of Jewish identity and religion. So what was the origin of the great myth about the exiling of the Jewish people following the destruction of the temple? Chaim Milikovsky, a scholar at Bar Ilan University, has found evidence in numerous contemporary rabbinical sources that in the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE the term galut, exile, was used in the sense of political subjugation rather than deportation, and the two meanings were not necessarily connected. Other rabbinical sources refer to the Babylonian exile as the only galut, which they regarded as ongoing, even after the fall of the Second Temple. Israel Jacob Yuval, a historian at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, went further. He proposed to show that the renewed Jewish myth about the exile in fact arose fairly late, and was due mainly to the rise of Christian mythology about the Jews being exiled in punishment for their rejection and crucifixion of Jesus. It seems that the source of the discourse regarding the anti-Jewish exile lies in the writings of Justin Martyr, who in the mid-2nd century linked the expulsion of circumcised men from Jerusalem after the Bar Kokhba revolt with divine collective punishment. He was followed by other Christian authors who regarded the presence of Jews outside their sacred land as the punishment and proof of their sins. The myth of exile began to be slowly appropriated and integrated into Jewish tradition. It was in the Babylonian Talmud, however, that the first statements appear linking the exile with the fall of the Second Temple. A Jewish community had existed in Babylonia continuously since the 6th century BCE, and not even during the powerful Hasmonean kingdom, did it ever seek to return to Zion. Perhaps, following the destruction of the Second Temple, this gave rise to the narrative linking the fall with renewed exile as an echo of an ancient event, a catastrophe that provided a religious rationale for weeping by the rivers that flowed not very far from Jerusalem. With the triumph of Christianity in the early 4th century CE, when it became the religion of the empire, Jewish believers in other parts of the world also began to adopt the notion of exile as divine punishment. The connection between uprooting and sin, destruction and exile, became embedded in the various definitions of the Jewish presence around the world. The myth of the wandering Jew, punished for his transgressions, was rooted in the dialectic of Christian-Jewish hatred that would mark the boundaries of both religions through the following centuries. What is more significant, however, is that henceforth the concept of exile took on an outright metaphysical connotation within Jewish traditions, going far beyond simply being away from one's homeland. Claiming descent from the original Jerusalem deportees was essential, like belonging to the seed of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, otherwise the standing of the Jewish believer as a member of the chosen people was not assured. Moreover, being in exile became an existential situation of diminishing territorial significance. Exile, in fact, was anywhere, even in the Holy Land. Later the Kabbalah made it a central attribute of the divinity, for the Shekinah, the divine spirit, is always in exile. The concept of exile came to shape the definitions of rabbinical Judaism vis-à-vis Christianity's growing might. The devotees of the Old Testament's Judaic faith rejected the salvation of the world that Jesus brought with his sacrifice. Continuing to identify themselves as Jews, they did not accept the Christian concept of grace created by the resurrection of the crucified Savior. To them, the existing world was still suffering, and would continue to suffer until the coming of the true Messiah. Thus the exile was a form of religious catharsis, which also served to wash away sins. The longed-for salvation, the antithesis of exile, could come only with the end of days. Exile, therefore, was not a location away from the homeland, but a condition that is not salvation. The anticipated salvation would come when the Messiah, King of the seed of David, arrived, and with this, a mass return to Jerusalem. Salvation would include the resurrection of the dead, who would also congregate en masse in Jerusalem. For an oppressed religious minority living in the midst of a hegemonic religious culture, the exile connoted a temporal defeat, the fall of the temple, but the future that would annul it was wholly messianic and totally outside the power of the humbled Jews. Only that future, whether immediate or distant, but certainly lying outside of human time, guaranteed the salvation and perhaps the coming of universal power. That was the reason Jews did not always seek to return to their ancient homeland, and the few who did so were denounced as false messiahs. There were, of course, some devout pilgrims who were permitted to make an individual act of going up to Jerusalem, and many went in order to be buried there. But a collective migration for the purpose of living a full Jewish life in the Holy City was not part of the religious imagination, and the few who proposed it were exceptional or eccentric. Curiously, it was the Karaite relationship with Jerusalem that led a good many of them to migrate there, and even to call on their fellow believers to do so. These Protestant Jews, who stuck to the Old Testament and refused to accept the oral law, the Mishnah and Talmud, were unaffected by rabbinical Judaism's rigid and confining conception of exile. They could ignore its prohibitions relating to the Holy City and settle there in large numbers. With their distinctive mourning over the destruction, they were known as the mourners of Zion. They apparently constituted the majority of Jerusalem's population in the 9th and 10th centuries. A number of rabbinical prohibitions forbade hastening the salvation, and therefore migrating to the source from which it would arise. The most prominent prohibitions were the famous 3 vows in the Babylonian Talmud, that Israel must not seek to rise up over the wall, that the Holy One blessed be He adjured Israel not to rise up against the nations of the world, that Holy One blessed be He adjured the idolaters not to enslave Israel overmuch, Tractate Ketubot No. 72. Rise up over the wall meant mass migration to the Holy Land, and this clear-cut prohibition affected Jews throughout the ages, instilling an acceptance of exile as a divine ordinance not to be broken. It was forbidden to hasten the end and rebel against God's Spirit. To the believers, the exile was not a temporary concrete condition that could be altered by migration across the world, but a situation that defined the entire existing physical world. Therefore, when the Jewish cultural centers in Babylonia declined, the Jews migrated to Baghdad, not to Jerusalem, although both cities were ruled by the same caliphate. The Jewish deportees from Spain migrated to cities all around the Mediterranean, but only a few chose to go to Zion. In the modern age, with its ferocious pogroms and the rise of aggressive nationalism in Eastern Europe, masses of the Yiddish people migrated westward, mainly to the United States. Only when the American borders closed in the 1920s, and again after the horrendous Nazi massacres, did significant numbers migrate to Mandatory Palestine, part of which became the State of Israel. The Jews were not forcibly deported from their homeland, and there was no voluntarily return to it.